Queer Relation Tips, an IAM Clinic podcast devoted to helping you, the LGBTQ plus community, create the love lives and relationships you crave.
I can still sense this God moment, probably in the mid-'80s, with God saying, look, you stay faithful to me and I'll look after you. And, God's honoured that right through. So my faith is still as strong as it's ever been. And there's been some amazing things that have happened as a result of that.
Hi, I'm Isaac Archuleta and your host. In today's episode, I had the great privilege to sit down with a lovely gay man who was born in 1956 and came out at the age of 25. The year was 1981, and coming out meant exposing himself to a New Zealand law of the time that imposed a 7-year incarceration sentence. I find his story, from coming out and facing religious persecution, to marrying a man, to stepping into his lifelong passion, to be a grand example of what resilience looks like. Let's take a listen. Hi.
Hi, we're there. Hello, good to see you.
How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm really quite good. I'm just having a relaxing Wednesday at home.
Oh, good.
Good. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Good.
And just potting around. I'm not going out a lot, trying to stay a little bit safe and at home and stuff. So I tend to be a bit of a homeboy at the moment. Some of church is happening, and they're doing a little bit of community work as well, and it's a bit of teaching and stuff. Yeah.
Great.
You're looking good.
Oh, thank you.
You're growing your hair out.
It's getting long. It is.
Yeah. Jeez.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Is that light on the just next to me too bright for you?
No, that looks great.
That's just coming in from outside. I can shut it off if necessary. So no, it's really good. I had just gone and I was just about, if necessary, to send you a link as well, but I thought, no, I'll just wait, and if we need, we can. So
good.
Yeah, but I'm missing my friends, and in the States and all. It's been a bit of a journey the last 2 or 3 years,
Hasn't it? I know.
Were you at Fort Lauderdale?
I was. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, that was basically the last time I had travelled, and and since then, of course, everything's just locked down.
I know.
Yeah. That trip for me was quite amazing. There was a whole lot of stuff because I had left New Zealand about, I think it was the 20th of November.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so it was a really long trip.
Mm-hmm.
I had travelled with, because I don't know if you know, my background is Salvation Army.
Okay.
And that helps inform a lot of perhaps what we'll talk about a bit today. And but I'm involved in ministry, and I'd been invited to go to Singapore and Japan on a ministry mission. So we left here in November, and then we had a few days in Singapore, which was really hot.
Okay.
Then flew into Tokyo. It's the third time I've been to Japan on ministry mission.
Wow.
And this time we went right up north. They flew us up into Hokkaido, the northern island, and so from the heat of Singapore to the cold of it was 3 or 4 inches of snow. Then we got back and spent a bit of time in Tokyo and around that area. Flew back to Singapore, and I left everyone at that point. And then I flew via Taiwan to California and spent a bit of time hanging out with some GCN friends. California was warm. Went up to Vancouver. I've got friends in BC who wanted me to preach, so I did that. And back Christmas at Seattle. I flew over to Fort Lauderdale. And coming back, it was easier for me to come back via Singapore So I had to fly instead of just coming back direct. So I ended up flying back from Fort Lauderdale, spent a few days with a friend in Seattle, back on 4 or 5 days in Singapore just to unwind, and then came home. But you could see that the borders were starting to get a bit anxious at that point. Even going into Taiwan and Singapore, in January, you could actually, they were starting to temperature test people. So you got an idea, this thing's going to be big. And of course, I got home, I think it was about the 16th of January, and I've been away for about 7 weeks.
Yeah. Wow.
Not been away since. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Sounds like you met your annual quota for traveling in that.
Oh, yeah, but I've got air points I want to use up.
Yeah, well, for sure.
Before I lose them.
Yes. Yeah. You probably want to get back out there and travel around again.
Yeah. So so that's that. So so you're talking about your podcasts, and I've had a little look, and obviously that there's a conversation to have, just possibly maybe there's something that we can look at or I can support you with.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to have you.
Yeah. Now, what's your actual? I mean, I know you talked a little about some of the vision, some of the experiences. Is that basically the direction you're particularly interested in?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff. In fact, I can send you. About 7 or 8 years ago, I sat down and I documented. I think I did about 23 pages, A4, not quite the same as US, but pages of just events, through my life that had led to me being the person I was. And there's some interesting nuances that may come out of it. So, I mean, first of all, I guess growing up, my parents were Salvation Army officers. We were brought up very secure, loving home, but we travelled around a lot. Because they were ministers, all of their ministry was in social areas, working with, and most of my time we were attached to like Men's Eventide, or what we would call like retirement villages, except they weren't quite so nice as those. They were really for people who often had alcohol addiction and a range of mental illnesses. And so wouldn't say it was necessarily a safe place for young boys to be growing up in, but life was good. And certainly my parents outlined a real, you could see through them the heart of what it meant to be Christ followers. When I was 15 or 16, my parents retired, and they had to move probably about 400 or 500 miles from where I was living on a different island. And the decision was made that I would stay living in Christchurch so I could finish my high school. But I was only 15 or 16 this year. So, as I say, I didn't leave home. I say my parents did. And I went to live with a family from church. Now, they were an elderly couple. He was strange. He was strange. And he used to have this thing. He used to like inviting young boys from church to come and spend a weekend. And there was a ritual where he'd bath them every night. And I'm sort of thinking, I was only 15 or 16, but it just didn't quite seem right. Fortunately, he didn't try bathing me. But then their daughter, her marriage broke up, so she moved in with her 2 children, and the household just became totally dysfunctional. So growing up, what I learned very quickly was that it was very easy to spend as little time in the house as possible. Fortunately, I was a bright student, so I was able to I spent a lot of time studying on the library, with church and stuff. But there would be times when I just didn't want to go home. The library's shut. And I discovered a sub-street culture in New Zealand. It was, for me, that was quite an exciting thing to discover. I mean, okay, I was connecting a lot with, it was all through the only way you could meet people was, doing the public toilets and stuff like that. So there was this whole, we're talking 1970s. When I was about 20, I mean, this thing got, when I was about 20, the police intervened on one occasion. And you need to understand that in New Zealand at that time, not only did the church condemn any gay people, but the law did as well. And the police basically said, you know what we do with boys like you? We lock you up. There could have been a 7-year incarceration period. That's what the law provided for.
That's scary.
So, so growing up, I was 30 before it was, we decriminalised. So I lived my first 30 years, knowing I could be actually not only, taken to court and sent to prison, and people were, not so much in the 70s and 80s because we were getting a little bit more towards understanding. When I was about 21, I met a man who has become my first romantic interest. He lived in the States, but sadly we couldn't live together. I had professional contacts after 6 years. Long-distance relationships don't work. So I passed on that. Came back and really just got back into church and, okay, I'm not going to be seen to be doing too much in the LGBT community. 1984, we went through decriminalisation. My church, the Salvation Army, absolutely did a shameful thing, and they set up a petition to stop the law changing.
Wow.
And I was so angry over that I actually decided it's time to come out, put a stake in the ground and say, this is not only is this nonsense, but this is not acceptable. And suddenly I found where I've been flying under the radar. I just dropped, and I thought, what can they do to me? And decriminalisation was coming, so I felt more safer there. My family was supportive, really. The church, not quite so much. So part of the problem with the church was that they were ignorant, and you don't give good information. I rode with it, and I can still sense this God moment, probably in the mid-'80s, with God saying, look, you stay faithful to me, and I'll look after you. And God's honoured that right through. So my faith is still as strong as it's ever been. And there's been some amazing things that have happened as a result of that. So anyway, effectively, I stayed in ministry. I met a man in the 80s who, he was married at the time, but we've been together since 1986. So, we're coming up 36 years. You'll probably meet him in a few minutes. He'll probably come home. So we've been together 36 years, and life's been good. Flew under the radar again, though, and just really didn't want to stir the pot. But started to get interested in not only in the political advocacy, but also from a theological point of view, just wanting to be able to sort of reconcile why is the church so anti-gay? Where's it come from? And is there something I can do about it? And that was really, I guess that was the foundation. In the mid 2000s, I met a young man who, I met him actually through a church-related event, and he and his wife and I became really good friends. I knew that he was gay. He never told me, but I just knew. Sure. Sure enough, he did come out to me a bit later on, and I remember the day he sat in my lounge and said, "Colin, I need to tell you something. My marriage was arranged." Surprise, surprise, I had worked something like that out. This morning I was diagnosed HIV positive, and I don't know how to tell my wife and family. Would you be there for me?
Oh, wow.
And there came this absolute realization, God's setting up this isn't just happening. Unfortunately, we'd also become very, I don't want to use the word affectionate, but there was a real closeness. And, we had situations in different, we could have easily ended up in a relationship. But he became very codependent, ringing 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day. And we could just saw his life spiral. And this was in 2000s. Ultimately, we saw it coming, but he self-harmed and is no longer here to tell his story. And I, at that point, sort of committed myself, I will never again stay silent when it was the harm. And I started just looking for ways to, sadly, my church, I couldn't tell them the whole story. They knew a little bit, but they didn't know the whole story. And I ended up as a bit of a mess, to be honest. That's the polite way of putting it. And I was due to go to Japan on ministry tour, and we were so the easiest thing, I don't know, you've probably seen this in your in the work you do with counselling, that often when people get themselves in a little bit of a dissonance, they find a way to keep themselves busy so they don't actually have to address.
Yes.
And I perfected that for about 18 months. And I was able to really keep that whole thing, under wraps. But, of course, changing jobs and other things. But, you can't keep doing that. You just can't. And there was a moment, and I remember sitting down thinking, look, there's got to be more to it than this. And Googling gay and Christian, of course, up came GCN. That started a whole new journey for me. A few months later, I was at my first GCN conference, which was Anaheim. As a result of that, I couldn't help but note there were a lot of people sitting around who were very obviously not able to engage with others, and me being me. I mean, New Zealanders and Australians see the world probably through different lenses, and we don't have any issue going up and talking to people and being friendly. So I just started doing that, and I don't know if you remember Nate Krogh. Nate was the admin of. He was basically Justin Lee's right-hand person in GCN. And he contacted me and asked for some advice on how can we do things better, started talking about hospitality. And as a result of that, long story short, I was invited to scope a hospitality role. And then, of course, invited into that role. And so I said, look, while I believe God will resource it, I'll be there. Well, that was 2009. I had been at every single GC and QCF conference stateside that's happened, except for one, and that was the one that was in Pittsburgh. Because I just put property on the market, and we were going through so it just wasn't going to work. So that was basically since that time, and doing hospitality. So and I mean I can go through probably about 12 conferences.
Wow. Yeah.
And even in the last 2 years. So that's been the journey. What I've seen is God just given me an absolute passion for the ministry. But not only with GCN and QCF, but has opened up doors with the Salvation Army.
Awesome.
Now, the way things have happened in the Salvation Army is just outstanding. And I see God at work in this. So, effectively, New Zealand knew they'd really stuffed up badly in 1985. And they did try and redeem themselves. That was the decision that was made by some leaders who had no moral compass, and they did it without good consultation, and they ended up with egg on their face, effectively, and came back to haunt them for years. But as a result of that, from the ashes in New Zealand then grew into being one of the strongest groups to actually stand up and speak for the voiceless and those who are marginalised. I got involved in an online group for Salvation Army people about 10 years ago. There were 20 of us. It was very poorly run. It was just a random group. And I just started getting involved and building it up, inviting people. We now, in our Facebook group, have over 2,700 members. We have Salvation Army members from right around the world. It's the largest voice of Salvation Army in the world. One of the things that just did my heart good, I realised about 5 years ago that changing theology is hard. You've got to changing people's minds. And, I mean, you can have all the doctrine, you can know all the history, but it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really started to think, so we have to do it in steps. And the very first step to me was quite clear. What we need to do is, first of all, change the understanding of people's minds that sexuality and gender identity is not a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can make that leap, then we can start building on the next thing. And then the next step, that actually happened relatively smoothly. So the next step was starting to address, conversion therapy.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I was fortunate because I had been at the conference in Orlando 2012, it was, the Alan Chambers conference,
mm-hmm.
and had been and sat through it, and we could see that the wheels were starting to fall off the bus. And so that was the next thing I started working on is, getting the message out that we've got to do something about stopping praying the gay away. Now, the Salvation Army in New Zealand, look, to their credit, very much tapped into me and asked for assistance. And we ended up being the first Salvation Army in the world to actually put a stake in the sand and say, we stand against conversion therapy. They put in when all the church, New Zealand has only just passed legislation about 8 weeks ago banning conversion therapy. And all of the right-wing conservative churches were all standing up and still going back, the old rhetoric. Salvation Army turned around and said, no, we stand for the marginalised. We know what the evidence is. Conversion therapy not only is harmful and does this sort of damage, but it is not consistent with our understanding of Scripture. And they were the only church that actually stood out and spoke against it. And I'm looking at, is this the same Salvation Army who 40 years ago had fought decriminalisation?
For sure.
So I'm really grateful. One of the things that I've realised, and I think this is just maybe divine inspiration, is that if you're going to be effective, there's 2 or 3 different ways of doing advocacy. And one of the ways is to get in there and just really, be vocal and shout and stamp. And that's not my style. My style was to sit down first. I'm going to get into scriptures. I'm going to actually learn, and I've spent quite a bit of time actually just sitting here. I can actually I can sit down and read New Testament Greek quite comfortably. So that was one thing I did. And I just started looking at the theology and, of course, some of the resources, particularly the work that Kathy Baldock is doing. And her work, she's been out, she stayed here with John and I. So it's been just building up that knowledge. Well, just yesterday I got an invitation. I've been invited onto a steering group for the Salvation Army in New Zealand to find a way to become more inclusive.
That's amazing.
That's just, and what they said to me when we've asked you to do this because we have seen your grace, we have seen the way that you have not only honoured God, but that you've actually worked through those issues in a way that people respect you. And so there's a lot of that. So that's really where I'm at now. I still have some issues. I also, with my group, and you're welcome to be added to the group, Salvos for a More Inclusive Church. There's a lot of advocacy and resources and that gets used. I see my role as pastoral because that's something that's missing. So, like, at least once a month, I'm putting up some form of reflection. At the moment, we're doing a Lenten series. We've done it for the last 3 or 4 years, and it's just but through an inclusive lens. Like last year, we did the 7 I am statements of Jesus from John's Gospel. This year, we're looking at the 7 last words of the cross, and it's amazing when you start to look at them, just how much you can actually talk. You can speak into the hearts and minds of, the LGBTQI plus alphabet soup community. So I guess that's just a bit of a run. I did jot down just a few things you may find useful. There's the topics around what are some of the positive outcomes that have happened, changes that I've seen, what are some of the lessons that have been learned. Just what a message is there a message for others? So I don't know. Is there anything in that would be useful for you?
Yeah, this is all great.
Yeah.
One thing that we're really focusing on is for this Pride is the theme, I am resilient. Yeah. And as I'm listening here, I just find myself almost like on my little notes paper here, I have like your name and then just next to it, like the words resilient. Like, I think your story here is quite profound in the way that you have almost kind of politically, religiously, however, but you've literally tackled this topic, this challenge in New Zealand quite forcefully in a beautiful way.
Yeah.
Where do you feel like that grit or that gusto, that motivation came from?
I look back, I think the very first awareness of it was probably 1985, during that law reform change. And it was a sense of sort of wanting to say, God, look, I'm done with this church. I'm done with the nonsense. And it was just that small voice in the back of my mind. And it was, I can only put it down to God's Spirit saying, no, stay. I need you. Be strong. When you read through Scripture, the number of times you see, verses, I'm thinking particularly of Joshua, be strong, do not be discouraged, for I am with you, I will be with you. There's this sense of, but also being aware that it had to be in God's time and not my time. I do remember, would have been not that long after, a good friend of mine who was a strong Christian woman, who had the gift of prophecy. Now, she said to me, look, there's something like God, I need to tell you that God's told me to tell you that he's got something really amazing in store for you, and that there's you are going to be used in a way to bring a reconciliation and healing to the LGBT church, but also to the church, because the church needed also people to lead them through that part of the process. So I think it goes right back to that. It certainly came to a head in 2005 with Michael's death, and that really did. That really knocked me, because we were such close friends, and having seen himself harmed as a result of basically Christian bullying from his church. And just actually seeing that and just thinking, this is not the gospel that brings life.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a gospel that, when Jesus said, feed my sheep,
mm-hmm.
that provides, nourishment for his people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, and there was a very clear moment, and I can pin it down to the exact day, and that was the Sunday morning of worship in my first GCN conference in Anaheim, and that would have been Sunday, the 6th of January, 2009.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I remember it specifically because I was still going through quite a lot of the processing, because Michael had been dead for probably about 18, 19 months, 19, 20 months. I'd managed to keep it under the, keep busy for a good year or so. And then there came that moment that God was saying, okay, it's time to address those issues which are yet unresolved.
Mm-hmm.
On that Sunday morning at that conference, it was quite a different conference. And they used to do things quite differently. I mean, on the Sunday morning, we basically had an evangelical service. It wasn't a, very much of the sort of the Episcopalian, offering where you actually, they brought in, I don't know have you ever heard of the Reverend Evelyn Shave?
Yes.
She came in and she was a rattling and shaking and moving, and, I thought, we were waiting for the fire to descend from heaven. And she preached up a storm. There was, unashamedly, she preached up a storm. That was the same GCN conference where Ray, what's his name? The music, well-known musician had just come out, Ray Bolts had performed.
Yes.
And the other person who was at that was Peter Gomes, who, of course, was a well-known, and it was just a wonderful introduction
mm-hmm.
to the concept of what could be happening in reconciling ministry.
Mm-hmm.
But so on the Sunday morning, as I said, Evelyn was there. We only had about 300 at the conference, and she preached up a storm, and I was sitting near the front because I'd been involved in some music, and she had an altar call. Now, I don't think we've ever had altar calls at conference since, but she had an altar call. Over 100 of our folk from that conference came forward for prayer.
Wow.
And I'm watching this going on, and I'm sort of thinking, I need to step up because there are people here who need prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And I spoke. I went up to one guy. He had his back to me. I couldn't see who it was. And as I would always do if I'm with someone during an altar call to pray, I would say, you identify yourself. You seek permission. Would you like me to pray with you? You don't just. And absolutely. And then when I saw who it was, he was a guy I'd spoken to the day before.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I didn't realize it was him. He was a former Salvation Army officer who had just been dismissed from officership a few months earlier.
Mm-hmm.
His marriage was in tatters, and he was God saying, this is the ministry. This is the manifestation of what I've been preparing you through. And the verse that came to me was from John 15. To do this, you need to be connected to the vine. God, I'm going to do something in your own life that is going to, upset you. It's going to, you're going to be really uncomfortable with it. I can't use you if you're not comfortable with that. So I think there was this moment of absolute, this is where the rubber hits the road.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm going to be serious, about being available to be used by God for this type of ministry then I need to be open to letting God do the work that God wants to do. So, I come back, I still hold very strongly to my faith and to, for me, Bible reading, prayer is an absolute vital part. Now, with the podcast, does it have a Christian focus, or you're more focused on LGBTQ? Because, I mean, I just want to be sensitive to that as well.
Yeah.
Because I know that there'll be people who will start listening as soon as you start the God, pulling the God card, they'll sort of switch off. But there's ways in which, we can just entrust that God will make that connection in their mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What was it like for you those first 30 years of living in a country where it was criminalized to be gay? How did that affect you, your self-esteem, your coming out?
I think it was part of the culture. So you didn't actually, first of all, we didn't have the social awareness and you didn't see gay people around. It was something people just didn't talk about.
Okay.
In fact, there was a real sense of, probably until I was 20 anyway, that I was the only one.
Mm.
And if you think you're the only one, you're not going to go out and try and the other thing which is fascinating, I also have quite a bit of sociology in my degree,
mm-hmm.
and the sociological impact. Most gay men were entering into mixed orientation marriages.
Sure.
That was just the culture, and you've probably seen that if you trace back through history. And I think I did actually hear some research even around the time that at least I think it was, I'd have to check on this, and it would be hard probably to find out, but at least 50%, particularly men, I can't speak on behalf of women, of gay men were finding it was easier to find a wife, have a family, and of course, and so there was this real culture, which is why, as I said, when I was about 16 or 17, discovering all these married men who just, had a particular energy in the work, and hey, I was young, I was happy to oblige. So I also, I grew up, not, I certainly wasn't green when it came to what two men could do together.
Sure.
But I never actually sensed that. I didn't see it as an oppressive situation. And I don't really recall too much where people were prosecuted. The threat was always there,
mm-hmm.
but the actual action. The other thing too is that there had been a number of attempts, even through the 70s, when I was probably in my early 20s, late teens, where there had been an attempt to change the law. And the Salvation Army, the gay, emerging gay movement had probably been, don't want to use the word their own worst enemies on this one, but one of the things they would not concede on, the age of consent for heterosexual relationships was 16. They wanted a different age of consent for gay men.
Oh.
And the gay community said, no, it's equality, either full equality, age 16, or not at all. And basically the answer was then it's going to be not at all. So it did derail that desire to change the law probably another 10 years.
Okay.
But it was, and I totally get why they would say, if it's 16 for straight, people, it should be 16 for gay and lesbian people as well. So I guess in many ways you could see that the winds of change were there,
mm-hmm.
but they never actually were able. It took a while for all the ducks to line up for that legislation to fall into place. And then, of course, not only that, but we had to make sure we had the people in the House, who would be able to pass such legislation. and I mean, New Zealand, when it was introduced, oh boy, I could tell you there was some horrible stuff coming up from the church.
Oh, I'm sure.
And some of it was just, some of the rhetoric, you just can't believe just how awful it was. There was one particularly nasty member of parliament who basically, I was at a meeting, he stood up and says, you know, look at the gays, you know, stand up all the normal people, you know, look at the gays, but don't look too hard. You know, you're staring into the eyes of Hades, you might catch AIDS. So again, that was another component as well as early 1980s, trying to get change, and we're dealing with the HIV epidemic as well, and not understanding as much as we do now, not having the medical knowledge. So there was a lot of, I think there was a lot of stuff that had to happen. But for me, I mean, I never ever felt that I would, that I was ever going to be, I was a sinner or anything because I was gay. I knew it was just who God had made me to be. And I certainly got to know a lot of other gay people. What it did do, though, of course, it meant you kept very quiet in church. Sure. You didn't talk about it. It does become a bit of an issue, though, when you're 30 and suddenly you find, you know, everyone else is getting married and you haven't.
That's a loud political statement.
Yeah, so there's a whole lot of nuances going on, particularly with, you know, as I said, from a political, from a socio, economical, from a, you know, you name it. You know, the dynamics of just living in a very I mean, New Zealand is based on the Westminster type of government, so it was always, you know, government here was always going to change. We do have one advantage, which you don't have in the States. Now, dare I say that? We're unicameral. We only have one house, so it doesn't have to go through a second reading to get the royal assent.
Okay.
Once the government passes the bill, it then goes to the Governor General for the royal assent. Now, there are not many governments, I think, that are unicameral. You know, where you don't have, you know, it's got to go through from the, you know, House of Representatives to the Senate, you know, to the Senate, or back vice versa. With that, of course, there could be the argument that you haven't got the checks and balances, but yeah. So that's been, I guess that's sort of just a bit of an outline.
Sure.
And of course, what I've discovered in the last, particularly probably 15 years, is just an amazing international number of friends. And another thing, now here's another thing my church did, and I'm trying to think, it would have been about 2017. I know, that was the year I didn't go. I couldn't quite afford to go. And my local Salvation Army called me to one side and they said, now we see the benefit that your ministry have. In fact, they used the words, we see the kingdom value. Now, that's real Christianese, if ever.
For sure.
We see the kingdom value of how God is using it. We know that here is a love gift of $500 to help you get to the States. But please don't tell others in the congregation.
Sure.
So, you know, there are all those sort of little nuances. And I can say, hey, this has just got to be God at work. It's got to, you know, this just isn't coincidence for me. There's stuff happening here. I do joke, though, you know, because we haven't quite in the Salvation Army got ourselves yet totally inclusive. We're still dealing with some challenging things. I joke a little bit about that. I used to be like Moses and feel that I was wandering in the wilderness for 40 years and wouldn't be allowed to cross, you know, into Canaan. But now I'm starting to joke that, like Jeremiah, I've been in captivity. I'll be in captivity for 70 years, and that's a theological joke, but you know what I mean.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So like the idea of, well, I'm Moses. I can see the promised land, but I'll never be allowed to enter it.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I guess so. I mean, if there's stuff from that, I'm sure, I'm more than happy to sort of meet and we can. How long would you normally need?
This is great. I have a couple of questions if you have a couple more minutes.
Oh, please. Yeah.
Okay.
No.
Great.
Yeah.
When you're talking about living through kind of that decriminalization era, if we want to call it that, you talk about it as though there was something, a type of confidence that almost protected you, protected your self-esteem, protected your dignity. What was that allowed you to walk generally unscathed?
I have to put it down. I think I was very fortunate in that I didn't have family members who were homophobic.
Mm-hmm.
New Zealand was also not a country which we deal with confrontation, even though on paper that was there. A lot of it, I think, came from the fact that if I had to say, where's it come from? I have to say, look, it was divine. That's something a lot of people may not necessarily understand. But if I have to trust that if God had actually wanted that to happen, then this was me seeing, things falling into place. Partly too is that I made sure that I read as much as I could. So that I understood not only from the LGBTQ perspective, but also from what was it that was creating the barriers for the church. Now, I didn't have the understanding I've got now about that. There is a real awareness that the reason why people were so homophobic or anti-gay isn't because they actually believed it, but it's learned behaviour.
Sure.
And learned behaviour, you just repeat what you've been taught. And if you're not taught anything different, then I guess, you're just going to repeat that same narrative. Because I was able to experience maybe different perspectives, do extra reading, things I had been taught, I was deconstructing them. So that if I'd had to go back and just hold to the things, the Bible says it's a sin, it's clear, this is what I probably wouldn't have been able to make the move that I have. But because I'd actually started to grapple with some of those difficult questions, I didn't necessarily have the answers, but I knew that the answers that I had been taught by the church did not necessarily hold substance when it came to actually being investigated under the light. And so I was more interested in finding out why.
That's wonderful.
I can tell you too, there's been a number of times when, from a mental health point of view, I guess my faith allows me to keep quite a strong mental health. I have meltdowns, and even now I sort of get really angry. Sometimes I sort of think this is really, but I also made sure that another thing I did, I made sure that I looked after myself. I surrounded myself by positive people, and I was open to meeting, to having gay and lesbian friends, not necessarily, people who you want to be romantically involved with, but just people who. So I was hanging out with Christians and I was hanging out with non-Christians. And I also knew who my friends were and who I could rely on if things get a little bit messy. And that would be one thing I would say if people are trying to get themselves, just find their voice, is find the people you can trust. Find it and don't hesitate to share with them. I think of a particular story. Now, this came from my second GCN conference. So I was heading the hospitality team, and I met a young man who it was at conference for the first time. This was the one that was in Tennessee, in Nashville. And he was a delightful young fella. I connected with him very well. But he told me his story that his parents, who were evangelical ministers, had forbidden him to come to GCN conference. And he just knew he had to be there. So he told me that he had actually climbed down the drain pipe on a Sunday morning, and his friends had picked him up and they'd all driven to conference. And he said, my parents had forbidden me to go. Now, he was a young man. I mean, he was about 18, 19, but, he said, but I just knew and he was in that real, what have I done? What have I done, mate? He couldn't get, but I just found him such a genuine young man. And we had a little bit of conversation. In the final circle, he came up to me and said, Colin, it's real southern drawl. I just want to take you home with me. And I just laughed. I thought, might be a bit too soon to meet mother yet, don't you think? And we just clicked. Well, I didn't see him for the next two conferences. So I lost basically contact with him. Mm-hmm. And then in Phoenix, 3 years later, he fronts up and he's at conference. Mm-hmm. And what do I see in front of me is a bright, vibrant young man who was confident. And he was a totally different young man.
Love that.
He had gone through the process. He had found his voice. Mm-hmm. He had also been prepared to accept that, he might have to put himself through college because, if the parents had said, well, this was one of the things. Not only that, but he had he was now in a relationship with another boy who I introduced him to that same conference. Mm-hmm. And I just saw this absolutely amazing change. Mm-hmm. And I see this time, and I've seen this many times with people at conference. You see them a year or two later, and they are not the same people. They've found a voice. But he came up to me and said, I need to ask you a question. He said, my godfather has disowned me. Mm. Now, here was a young man who's in his 20s, but my godfather has disowned me, and I need a Christian influence, godly Christian man influence. Would you become my godfather?
Oh.
That's another story from that conference. So he married his husband. They are now married. They live in Washington State. I saw them, actually, I had dinner with them just before I came over to Fort Lauderdale. It was lovely to see them. They're an amazing couple and have just found themselves, So those are the sorts of stories, when you see that, you realise it's not about me. And if part of that resilience comes from knowing what is possible, mm-hmm. And what, and when you see it, I try and live that out, because if people see a confidence and a positive focus, then hopefully that rubs off, mm-hmm. and they realise it is possible. It's very similar to there's a campaign. I'm just trying to think, to the It Gets Better campaign. When you start to see the community embracing that and showing that we're not always going to be facing the same issues that we are, it does get better. Yeah, and your challenge and your invitation is to become authentic, to find your authentic self, and just to be aware that you can make a difference in the world, that you're able to make a difference in the lives of the people you meet, to be open to what other things can be happening in your world. That's become a guiding thing for me. It's very much the what drives the work I still continue to do with QCF. I mean, I don't know if you're aware, there is another group called Christian, which is very much following on from the GCN heritage. Are you aware of them?
I am. Is it the Trey Pearson group or Trey?
Yes. The Trey Weaver. Yeah. Now, I love those guys. I know them all well. They've already told me, you've got to make a priority to be here next year. And I thought, nice, but priorities have to line up. One of the challenges, I mean, I know that you came in very early into leadership at QCF in the interim process. There were a lot of folk, and I don't need to tell you this, you'll know this, who really struggled with the way in which GCN had morphed into a different form of organisation. I also was well aware that there were dynamics that were going on that required that change to happen. I know Justin well enough to know that there were some cracks in the armour, and I could see that. And for me, the bottom line wasn't about allegiance to GCN. The bottom line was about being there for people at their time of need and helping them through that. And when you look at QCF now, our members don't give a toss about what happened in 2018. That they're not interested in that. They are looking for a community. They're looking for people who will support them. Unfortunately, a lot of the GCN folk polarised it and made it a political event. And for me, I won't go there. That's another thing I think about a bit of my personality, is that if I do have to draw a line in the sand, I can be quite absolute in saying, no, this is not a healthy space. This is not a good thing to do. I hear you. I acknowledge you. I'll give you space to take whatever view you like. I lost friends because of it. And my view was, well, so be it. Go and have a nice life.
Sure.
But the interesting thing is that my friends who are still involved in like the Out Christian and Out at Sea, and or they still have this absolute love and respect for them. And I treat them as the same space as I would anyone who I meet through QCF. We're a different organisation.
For sure.
One of the things about Fort Lauderdale, one of the questions in my mind when I went to that conference was, have I run my time? I've been doing this for 12 years. Is it now time to basically say, the journey is over? It's a totally different organisation that GCN used to be. It looks different. And I went there that was the big question that was on my mind, and I was wanting to discern in my own, just clarity, just what my future was. I came away from that. I would put Fort Lauderdale as probably the second most influential conference of the DCA and QCFs that I went to. Some were highly influential. They've all had their moments. But I came away with the sense of absolutely, there's still work to be done, and I'm privileged to be involved. But I am unashamedly evangelical when I'm talking with my gay friends.
Cool. That's awesome.
Because, the God who I know, the Jesus who I love, offers the same abundant life, and we can sometimes get so lost in feeling that we're